American establishment culture would like us now to believe that Trump's departure, which may be imminent, is going to save the United States and the Republic and, these other great things that need saving. But I would like to submit, imagine when you're in your home and your light bulb begins to flicker. Your fear immediately is, it's not just the light bulb, it's the wiring. And you want desperately to believe it's the light bulb. You want desperately to believe that the filament will burn out. And then you can gingerly remove that light bulb and put another one on and it doesn't flicker. And you think, saved. Millions of dollars or whatever it takes to get new wiring, saved. Don't have to call the electrician and feel humiliated again. Electrician said, well, it's tube and bulb and, things that you don't understand. And you stand there thinking, every time the electrician says something I don't understand, it's going to cost more. This is how people feel when they take a car into the garage. You're never sure. You took the car in. The more they speak, the bill is going to increase. So liberals right now believe that the light bulb is defective. That is Trump. The filament is flickering. What they don't want to imagine is that the wiring is short. That Trump might go tomorrow. Pence might appear. And in fact, it's not even Pence. Pence is, as Jeremy Scahill so correctly put it, a combination of Dick Cheney and Jerry Falwell. You might suddenly think we'll be saved by Pence. Americans have gone crazy. We'll be saved by Pence, a combination of Dick Cheney and Jerry Falwell. But it's not about Pence either. I'm going to come back to what I think it's about. Or Americans will say, Bannon is horrible. Oh my God, I listened to that speech. It was horrible, scares me. It's a dark side. I don't know what he's saying. They say, the mature people in the White House will protect America. Then you want to remind them that they're talking about H.R. McMaster, who in his book on Vietnam said that if only we were allowed to bomb without restraint, the Vietnamese would have been on their knees. McMaster somehow becomes the grown-up in the White House. And you think, have you lost your mind? It's like people who believed during the election campaign that Ted Cruz was the moderate conservative. This is a guy who wanted to basically nuclear bomb Syria. He said, I want to make the desert glow. How is this guy acceptable? So this belief that the bulb is flickering, and if you just remove the bulb and put a new one in, everything will be okay. This is how I understand the exercise of watching, say, MSNBC, or reading the New York Times or the Washington Post. They are imagining that the bulb is defective and that a new bulb is going to solve everything. In fact, what I'm going to suggest in the next 12, 13 minutes is that this is not a problem of the bulb. This is the problem of the system. It is gravely, gravely in crisis. Now, you, like I, have met at the street corner very well-meaning religious people on one side of the street, left-wing radicals on the other side, each of them selling you a newspaper, each of them telling you the world is coming to an end. One because of God's dispensation, the other because capitalism is going to collapse. And you run away from both. You triangulate down the middle, saying, I can't hear you, and you run down the street. Now, I'm generally not the kind of person that walks around saying the world is coming to an end. The end is nigh. Gird yourselves. Put on your Mormon underwear. He's bringing you up any minute. You don't want to be naked to him when you go up there. On the other hand, this does seem a little odd and scary. And it also seems odd and scary because, to my mind, there is a crisis that's much deeper than the politics. And that's what I want to just talk about for a little bit. There is so much that what Bannon says that's correct. And that's what I think is interesting. When Trump gave his inaugural address, he used a phrase, American carnage. And, a lot of people criticized him, said that his inaugural address was too bleak. How could an American believe that? America is a country of optimism. You're meant to always say, the city on the hill, the beacon will shine brighter than before. You can't be pessimistic about the American project. One must be optimistic. And yet here was Trump in a speech most likely written by Bannon talking about American carnage. It's like the name of a horror film. How could that have been the principal theme of his inaugural address, American Carnage? Now, the problem with that phrase is adding American to the carnage, because the carnage really is global. And this is the carnage, in a sense, to be rather straightforward, of capitalism. Because, I don't have very much time to get into this, but two of the net effects of capitalism, two of the outcomes of capitalism, are essentially what we have seen for the last 150 to 200 years. One is increasing immiseration of the bulk of the population of the world. People are not looking like they're having very happy dreams at night because they're not having an easy time sleeping at night. Why? Because their work days stretched into the night. Because their lives have basically been overtaken by work, either looking for work desperately or working two jobs or traveling very far for work. Most people's work lives have eclipsed the rest of their life. The increasing immiseration, if not in monetary terms, in human terms, is one of the outcomes of capitalism. This was, I think, brought out in a book of immense obviousness by Thomas Piketty, where Piketty basically proved the obvious, which is that there's inequality in the world. Thomas, let me take you for a drive through Bombay, for instance. Let's go for a drive in Bombay. Let's just have a look in Chicago. Let's drive around Chicago and feel the edge of inequality. Really, was there a need for the world intellectual population to be so surprised by Piketty's book, to celebrate it so greatly? Such an obvious singular point. Anyway, one of the outcomes of capitalism is immiseration, inequality, etc., where systemic risk is basically borne by ordinary people. The rich never bear. And we know all this intuitively. Banks collapse, money goes to save the bankers. None goes to save people who are being evicted. Systemic risk always borne by ordinary people, never borne by the system or by the elites. Second outcome of capitalism is sustained, rigorous substitution of human workers by machines. Now, you might say, I don't know what you're talking about, but let me ask you a question. The last time you went to the airport, who checked you in? It was either your computer at home or it was that kiosk at the airport. Nobody stands in the queue and talks to somebody and says, here's my thing. That worker back there, it's very easy to say, United, horrible company. Why do these people on the plane behave so badly? These people on the plane don't start getting paid until the handbrake on the plane goes down and the plane starts to reverse. Our outrage on social media, those are the most overworked workers. You can't imagine, they're probably in delirium on the plane when they're seating people. And people are often extraordinarily rude to them. This is a systemic problem, not that there's one rude worker here or one rude American Airlines person. That's how we get worked up about it. I can't believe, who is that person? Let's shame them. We don't want to shame the system, but machines substituting for labor, putting immense pressure on the few people that remain working. So the airline is a great example, but banks are another example. You have ATM machines with which you interact, and then there's just a few people doing extraordinarily complicated jobs with numbers of people wanting to see them. The people who deal with wires and things like that. So you narrow the number of people, you let machines substitute, and then put much more pressure on the ones that remain. Those of you who are teachers know exactly what I'm talking about. The more machines come in, the more, in fact, on you, so that you're then sitting at 9 o'clock at night and you get a message from your supervisor saying, don't forget the meeting tomorrow at 8. It's 9 o'clock at night. I should be watching some crap on TV. I shouldn't have to be reading an email from my supervisor, because if I don't respond to it, at 9:30 the supervisor writes again and say, didn't you see my email? It's 9 o'clock at night. This is my time. You don't have any time. This is the city of the 8-hour day. You know exactly that 8 hours is a joke. So machines substitute for labor but put more pressure on the labor that remains employed. So they don't liberate you. Machines actually oppress you more. In Northern Africa, from one end to the other, there are trade unions of workers who are college graduates who are unemployed. So they are unions of college graduates who are unemployed. This is a phenomena that we are seeing across the world, where those who don't have a college degree might end up finding some kind of work. Those in college, some of them get very high-paying jobs, but a very large number of them cannot meet the expectations. So they basically become part of the systematically unemployed. Hundreds of millions of people around the planet Earth essentially no longer needed for capital accumulation. They have become basically the surplus population of capitalism. They are not needed anymore. Chicago has its surplus in very large numbers as well. This is what capitalism does. Now add to that the next keyword. I'm going to give you 5 keywords. First is capitalism. Second keyword is globalization. When globalization arrived in the 1980s, it arrived in a very specific way, that capital was allowed to break borders, finance and commercial and industrial capital, but labor had to be trapped in borders. So you had free movement of capital, but labor was not free. So only one part of the economic bargain was freed. The other part remained to be held in national containers. The other aspect about globalization was the northern countries wrote the rules for globalization to benefit northern capital much more than southern capital, which was anyway much weaker than northern capital. Now what this meant was that by 1992, when the Chinese basically allowed their workers access to big capital could come into China and utilize this enormous workforce. By the time the Chinese delivered their workers to global capital in 1992, almost every country in the world had delivered its labor by 1992 to world capital. The Third World Project had basically collapsed, so workers from previously autarkic economies in the Third World were delivered to multinational capital. Soviet Union collapsed, Eastern Europe collapsed by 1991. They delivered all those workers to global capital, and then by 92 the Chinese came and finished the deal. By 1992, because workers were still trapped inside the national container and capital could move, and because northern capital was much more advantaged because it helped write the rules of the new dispensation, northern capital could take advantage of what is known as labor arbitrage. It could decide, thanks to new technologies, communications and transportation networks, etc., to basically break up factories and place bits and pieces of them anywhere in the planet it chose. This is what we call the disarticulation of production. Anywhere in the planet you could put little pieces. Now, because you're putting little pieces of what used to be gigantic factories, and because you are not investing in the factory. In other words, the capital itself doesn't invest in a factory. Nike doesn't make any shoes. You allow subcontractors to invest in those countries and hire labor, which is now competing globally, and that subcontractor will produce a piece of the product. So disarticulation of production is also the disarticulation of risk. Now, the risk in capitalism is no more held by capital. It is held by the petty producer at the other side of the planet often. So what you start to see is you start to see a kind of topography of capitalism where at the very low levels there's dog-eat-dog competitive capitalism. So between, say, a factory in Haiti and a factory in the Dominican Republic, both on the same island, both producing textiles, there's fierce competition between these two small factories which are maybe stitching on the sweatshirt, University of Chicago. And that's what these two factories stitch, University of Chicago, and they are in dog-eat-dog competition. Meanwhile, the retail house that has the contract to the university doesn't actually compete with anybody. At the top level of capitalism, it's all monopolies. So whether it's Apple, it's Nike, it's the people who do college sweatshirts, these are all monopolies. They set prices, they engineer the way the system works. They don't compete with anybody. And they are allowed to exist because they have immense political power. So capitalism has this strange topography now of monopolies at the macro level and fierce laissez-faire dog-eat-dog competition at the micro level. That's what the system then produces. But meanwhile, in the north and in very many pockets of the south, increasing workers are being displaced by machines. A study was done by Bowling Green. Conservative economists studied job loss in America, just as an example. And what they found was that only 12% of American job loss is because of trade rules. 88% is because of mechanization. The bulk of jobs lost in the United States are because of mechanization and increased productivity. Now, we know this as university professors. When I first went into this industry, our department used to have its own administrative assistant. Now, 5 departments share one administrative assistant, and everybody who's a chair has to do the kind of jobs the admin used to do before. So you've fired 4 people, essentially, by agglomerating everybody, and you allow email and computers to help the department heads do the jobs that used to be provided out to somebody else to do. Those people are unemployed, and you get these professors now having to do admin work where the stress on them is much greater. So this cleaves society greatly. You have people structurally unemployed, and you have a very small number of people with permanent jobs, also waged in one way or the other, but working 2-3 times as hard as they used to before. And not understanding when people say there are no jobs out there. There's a naivete that strikes those who have jobs and who see productivity increase in not seeing that their productivity increase is related to the endemic joblessness of the many. This is globalization. It produces a crisis. The crisis it produces is, on the one side, as I said, increased social inequality, and on the other side, joblessness. Now, neoliberalism is not actually the author of this crisis. It's the first attempt to solve the crisis. And its solution comes on many axes. One axis is basically to cannibalize resources, to make sure you can enhance your budgets, to continue doing some kind of social spending, moderate social spending. So you cannibalize resources. You privatize education, privatize healthcare, privatize this, privatize that, commodify water, things like that. That's the well-known policy slate of neoliberalism. But there's also a cultural policy slate of neoliberalism equally important, which is the theory of the entrepreneur. It constructs this idea and tries to sell it to create hegemony in the population, that what you need to be is not a citizen, but an entrepreneur. Citizenship is not what we cultivate in the 21st century. We cultivate entrepreneurialism. So in schools, you have competitions for students. You can get $10 to start with and go and start a stock portfolio. And at the end of the term, if you can make your $10 to $20, you get an A. If you get $10 to $18, you get a B. They actually monetize grades in this fashion. But the point isn't to teach you how to work the stocks, but to create the entrepreneurial spirit. Unleash the animal spirits in people. Don't produce community, produce entrepreneurial individuals. It's not enough to say produce individualism. It's actually a specific cultural kind of individualism. Don't worry about heroes in society. Our heroes are philanthropists. They are so kind. Forget that they don't pay taxes, but they donate money to us. Let us carve their name like great Roman emperors in marble in the front of the NGO. Let's write Bill Gates. Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation, we bow to you for your generosity. Not for the fact that you don't pay taxes, but because you are so kind and philanthropic. Philanthropy is the other side of entrepreneurialism. Our heroes are not sports people, but philanthropists. They must be celebrated. So this is the kind of cultural avenue pushed by the neoliberal policy slate. It's the other side of privatization. Because the idea is, if you can produce enough entrepreneurs, they will produce enough value to increase the bulk of growth in the economy, and they may hire people. But we know this is not going to happen. It's an illogical theory. It was always premised on failing. Because why would you, if you were an entrepreneur, if you were at the University of Chicago and you invented a device, that you could just pop into your eye if you lost an eye and it works. If you invented some kind of artificial eye, why would you manufacture this in Chicago? You'd manufacture this in Malaysia. You'd go somewhere where the labor costs are low. You'd go somewhere where you can have people with, decent skills who are unemployed, college degrees, PhDs even in Bangalore, who will work in a factory, essentially with robots to produce the artificial eye. Because they are cheaper than hiring labor here. Why would you hire labor here? The arbitrage works against you. So the neoliberal policy was always slated to fail. Having failed, what comes next? And this is the emergence, in a sense, of cruel populism. Because cruel populism, which is my last keyword, cruel populism is interesting. It shares something with Nazism. And I can say a little about that before we start chatting. Cruel populism is the following. Unlike neoliberalism, cruel populism says, yes, it's terrible. See, neoliberalism, because its cultural content is about entrepreneurialism, generally likes to speak as if the world is sunny. Bill Clinton was the king of that. We're going to get you off welfare. You're going to become an entrepreneur. You're going to create value in your community. There'll be enterprise zones. And these enterprise zones are going to suddenly boom. Every street with blight is going to have Starbucks, Wi-Fi. Suddenly you're going to be as if you're in like a Volkswagen commercial, listening to some European pop music, driving around going, yeah, my life is great. So that is the imagination of neoliberalism. Everything is super, consumption is going to save us. But cruel populism is much darker as ideology in its notions. It also tells the truth. It says that things are bad for you. Now, interestingly, there is an error in the analysis of how Mr. Trump won and how the right is gaining in Europe. It's not the white working class that went behind Trump. This is a very wrong analysis. It's the white-collar workers, not the big bourgeoisie, because they anyway are split cleverly between the two parties in order better to tether them. That's not the point. You don't look at the bourgeoisie to understand the way the wind blows, because they split evenly very tactically. I think it's a clever decision. Always have your hip liberals with the Democrats and your, steak-eating, Manhattan-drinking fellas with the Republicans to make sure everybody's okay. No, it's not them. The show on television, The Office? That's the America I'm thinking of. It's the office parks in Ohio and in Pennsylvania. I went for a Trump rally in Pennsylvania, and people there were some people in biker jackets and ready to beat the crap out of you. That's the old, classic racist crowd. They generally either don't vote or they vote Republican. That's the classic racist crowd. Those are irrelevant people, in a way, because they are marginal in terms of their ability to swing large publics behind them. These are the hardcore racists. But the people that are interesting are those people who basically look like office workers, who are basically data processors, who worked in the office, in some office park outside Columbus, Ohio, in a suburb. And on the basis of that job, they bought a suburban house, and they had this life. And then, that disappeared. Now remember, the white working class lost its jobs 25 years ago. Its crisis has been going on for a long time, and nobody gives a damn about these jobs. Gary, Indiana, just outside here, you drive past US Steel, that's been shuttered when I was in grad school. We used to go and visit there just to take pictures of it, saying, this is once what America was, and it's been closed, and you can see the cobwebs, it's never coming back. Those jobs went. These are the jobs that are outsourced to Ireland, India, Malaysia, China. These are BPO, business process outsourcing jobs. Now, it's very interesting that these are jobs that are there. These are targeted. About 2 years ago, Donald Trump went on Steve Bannon's show on Breitbart. And on this show, Bannon asked him, what do you think of the H-1B program, which brings in highly skilled workers basically into the tech sector and into banking, etc. Bannon hates Indians, by the way, and I'll come back to this in a minute. If you think he's a racist and a hater of Muslims, he doesn't hate anybody as much as he hates Indians. It's extraordinary. You got to listen to his radio program. And, Trump at the time in his naive way said, no, I love these guys. They're smart. We should bring them in. Because after all, in the Trump Corporation, there's a ton of these H-1B type people, doing the computer work. Bannon calls him in. Ajay, come in here. Fix my computer. Some guy, Ajay, comes in, and it's working. Trump doesn't know how to work a computer. Doesn't know how to spell. So, Ajay, check my spelling. So, he asked him, and Trump says, I love these guys, they're great. And Bannon was kind of subdued in that interview. The next time Trump came on the Bannon show, Bannon asked him again, what do you think about H-1B? And Trump said, it's terrible, the program should go. It's a horrible program. And then he started to go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, all these states, and rail against H-1B. He'd say, these people come here. And Bannon said something important which Trump didn't repeat. He probably didn't understand what Bannon said. But Bannon said that they don't have Jefferson democracy in their DNA, which is a very nice way of talking about race. They don't have Jefferson democracy in their DNA. Other people have Jeffersonian democracy in their DNA. Muslim terrorists, Mexican rapists, and Indian nerds don't have Jeffersonian democracy in their DNA. This is the triumvirate of hatred of this political platform. So Trump then joins in and is vituperative. He goes at it. They knew they were appealing to basically the white collar workers from the office parks who had been displaced and had been the leaders of the Tea Party movement. This is what I don't understand in the American media. They keep talking about this white working class. See, in America, nobody talks about the phrase working class. Everybody is firstly supposed to be middle class. Until this election happened, and suddenly all the TV channels started talking about the working class. These people don't understand class at all anyway on television. So their specificity is not to be taken seriously. What they mean is, when these guys who make millions of dollars to sit in front of a TV camera and talk nonsense all day, when these guys talk about the working class, they're thinking about the person who sits in an office park at a computer. They actually may have a better intuitive understanding of class than some of the times we teach class. These are also working class people. But they are not working class in the sense that their collars are blue and their hands are greasy. They work in these office parks. So this displacement is very important. And now I'm going to come back to, they identify correctly, the cruel populace, that there is a kind of carnage in jobs, that there's been a big job loss in these sectors. And it is because of globalization. It is because of labor arbitrage. I can't understand, again, when economists come on TV and say it has nothing to do with, how can it not have anything to do? Entire back offices moved abroad, and entire companies were created in India, like Tata Consultancy Services, to bring people in for 6-8 months to work in insurance, in medical industry, etc., to do computer work here on short-term contracts, what we call indentured coolies, high-tech indenture. This is what's happening. How can you deny labor arbitrage as a factor? So, but whereas the cruel populace agree with reality on this one point, they don't allow the implications of the agreement to go all the way. And we can talk about this in a minute. What they do instead is they take the first exit they see, which is racism. And that's why I associate this thought with Nazism. They see the problem that capitalism has produced joblessness. But rather than indict the system and try to think of new ways to live in a society not of work but of leisure with machines, they take the first exit they find as a consequence of the furrows created in American history, and they blame Mexicans, Muslims, H-1B workers, etc. That's the first exit that they take. In the same way as the National Socialists or the Nazis correctly identified the crisis in capitalism in the 1920s and 30s. They talked openly about capitalist instability, joblessness, etc. But then they also took the first available exit. Instead of indicting this abstract system of social domination, they blame Jews. They blame Jews as the stand-in for international finance. It's the same kind of thinking. This is why I think of these guys as Nazis more than fascists. Fascism requires a different set of conditions. The United States is not in a situation of impending fascism. But these guys ideologically are basically Nazis. So to end very briefly, then, because we're going to talk some more, Trump can come and go. He is an irrelevancy to my thinking. He is a sideshow. He will embarrass himself. He'll embarrass the elite. At some point, they might make an arrangement. He decides to not speak so much, or he is indeed impeached, or something happens to him. But this problem will remain. Neither neoliberalism nor cruel populism will answer the actual problems faced by people, which is joblessness. And sadly, in the West in particular, where this crisis has been percolating for decades, the left has not articulated a believable answer. What is the left vision to endemic joblessness? You see, the left believes, in a way, at least the kind of what passes for a left in the United States believes, the answer is to get jobs for people. And I really hope we'll talk about this more, but I'm not going to say, I'm going to end with this line. My hope is to live in a world where we only work maybe 1 or 2 hours a day. And we spend the rest of our time meeting, chatting, doing political work, building strong communities, building neighborhood organizations, loving people around us, and not dying, essentially, letting our minds die at work. Imagine that world for a minute. This is still May. Yesterday I went to the Haymarket area where there's no memorial anymore. There's now luxury condos being built. But they asked for an 8-hour day, where they said 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what you will. Today we don't understand the concept what you will. It's my feeling that the left globally has to seize on that phrase, and what you will. Because, the goal in life is to be people, not to be workers or to be rich. I'll submit to you, the goal in life is not to be an entrepreneur. It's to be a human being. And why can't we talk openly about being human beings? Thanks a lot.
What do you think is the continued fascination with the factory and the factory worker, both for the Democrats, for the Republicans, but I think for still some parts of the left too?
It's a great question. I think, American culture and work is a curious feature. There is a kind of masculinism about work. That what is work? Work is a miner. You go in a mine, that's work. A nurse working in a hospital is not quite the same as a miner. Or you're in a big factory, you're beating metal, building a car. The irony is those are the jobs that went 25, 30 years ago. It's not like the mines were all closed under Obama. They've been closing, for decades. In fact, that's why even under Obama, they began to loosen regulations, and we saw those 2 mine disasters. Those were not under George W. Bush. They were in the Obama period. Some miners were trapped. Many of them died. So this idea that the way work is understood. And the other thing is, for me personally, the first time I came to America, one of the things I really appreciated about the United States is there is a certain egalitarianism with labor. I come from a society where even the middle class, if the light bulb, I'm on light bulbs a lot today, light bulb goes out, they'll call somebody fix the light bulb. Some paid person will come with a ladder. It's not a difficult thing to fix. But there's a sense that I don't have to do it. I hire people to do it. So one of the, I think, very positive things about the American experience is that there is, I'm not going to call it the dignity of labor because that's a wrong phrase, but there's a kind of egalitarianism. Everybody seems to have a toolkit. I always tell my immigrant friends, when you move to America, you have to go to a hardware store and buy a kit. Because, you can't just call people and say, my faucet is no, you have to learn how to work a wrench. You have to learn how to change your faucet. You'll have to learn how to fix a pot. It's too expensive to call a plumber. Learn a few basic skills. So there is this thing in the imaginary that everybody believes that, I'm in a suit, working in a bank, basically demolishing factories. But I have this idea that work is the factory. And, there is, and you can see this in the American version of the show The Office, there is a certain embarrassment about office work, menial office work. Like, that show is so interesting because they never actually do any work. And it's an extraordinarily popular show. They're just sort of hanging around. It's all about office gossip. My sister used to work for a call center from her home. And it was extraordinarily tense because there was none of the chit-chat. So now imagine those office parks closed down. If they don't outsource you abroad, they insource you into your bedroom, where you're basically starting your shift at 5 in the morning at a desk that you have to buy, 2 computers that they provide you. And when you need to take a pee during your shift, you have to write to a supervisor and say, can I get 5 minutes personal time? And then the clock stops and you go to the bathroom. So what I'm saying is that this imaginary of work, nobody wants to admit what work actually looks like is not glamorous in the way the films, make that kind of macho work glamorous. So you don't actually see those people as real in the office park.
I mean, the masculinization of work, I think, is really interesting. And one thing in the contemporary moment in the United States is that there are actually 80,000 steel workers, right? But 800,000 nursing assistants, right? And so part of what we're seeing and part of, I think, what people can't accept is the feminization of work. So I wonder then and it seems to me the kind of work, feminized work, work of reproduction, the labor of reproduction, that's not a kind of work that disappears in the way that the factory can disappear. So as we talk about kind of a post-labor economy or a post-work economy, how do you think about questions of reproduction, questions of care work that are constitutive of being human in some ways?
Because of the way in which capitalism functions and sort of captures more and more of work and commodifies it, it was interesting that it was Marxist feminist economists in the 1970s that put the slogan out there, wages for housework. In other words, let's at least make a so-called market or see what we can value housework at in order to understand its contribution to GDP, etc. I think that was an interesting political maneuver. I mean, it's not like they expected wages actually to be paid, but it was an interesting political maneuver to talk about how GDP is itself a highly masculinized concept. It externalizes so much reproductive labor, which actually generates value. So that, there was a study done by a Wellesley College professor published in the American Economic Review in the current issue, in which she shows that the reason there's a gender pay gap is not only because women as such get paid less, but because to amplify that, the expectations are that women will not take the so-called demanding jobs because they have to have care in the house to settle. So for instance, even children or elderly parents. And these kind of expectations, gendered expectations, then mean that they don't vie for the job. That's the 15-hour job in a financial house or whatever. They'll say, look, I'm quite happy with working a 8-hour, 9-hour job. I don't want a 15-hour job because I have to go home. I want to read to my kids, whatever. So she shows that in the data that when college women and college men first get jobs, they get jobs at a similar salary level. But then after the first 10 years, the gap opens up. And that's the years, some of this is obvious of children, but then also elderly parents, the raising. There was a great book by Nancy Folber, UMass economist, called The Invisible Heart, in which she argued that, it's the fantasy economy that works on the invisible hand. The real economy works on the invisible heart. So I often ask students, I'll put a demand curve and supply curve on the blackboard, and I'll say that's the optimal price where they meet. But of course, this assumes that you are bidding for your best deal, you know. And so then I asked them, when you negotiate with your parents, for instance, do your parents bid for the best deal? In fact, parents don't know how to bid with their children. You know, the demand curve for the parents is useless because they'll say, okay, you know, I want to give you everything. You know, some parents are crazy and say, you know, you have to work for my affection. Okay, they are crazy. But most parents do everything for their children. You know, they're not out there bidding with their kids. So is not the life of the family such a large part of people's lives? So how come the utility curve cannot explain this? That means it's not a universal theory of life. So instead of the invisible hand being generalized as a theory of life, rather than thinking that selfishness is the prime motive by which we organize society, why not understand society organized by a million motives, including by the invisible heart? And if we do that, we'd have a completely different understanding of society. I mean, I don't like this show, the Freakonomics. The reason I don't like it is they use the utility thinking to understand odd phenomena in the world. I would be much more interested in using a multiplicity of thinking to understand the multiplicity of the world. A theory cannot explain everything. There's no general theory of everything. You know, nobody has attained the status of God. So economics should not be allowed to explain everything. It should be told, you explain maybe how pricing functions in this part of the market. But even in a market, you can't understand everything. In this French election, boy, that's a real sign that the world is in a sewer. I mean, the choice is between a lunatic right-wing thug and this guy who wants to fire all public employees. And somehow he was the progressive. I mean, it's a stunning place we have got ourselves into. When I said this to somebody, she said, imagine that. At least in France, they have 120,000 public employees to fire. I mean, in the United States, where will you find them? You know, in Chicago, how many public employees are left? I don't know. I was at the Navy Pier. I saw the strikers there from the Teamsters. And I took the flyer, and the flyer was talking about 43 workers who were being, 43 workers unionized. The rest of them ununionized there. Amazing. So, yeah, Global South, in terms of the schemes, I mean, let's just imagine India for a second. Half the population of India, which is twice the US population, 770 million people. That's about twice the US population. Half the Indian population lives in deprivation. That means they don't know where the next meal is coming from. I mean, that's half of India's population. Twice the US population. It's just off the radar even in Indian policy making. So even in India, when they came up with cash transfer schemes in rural areas, they were honestly abysmally produced. I mean, what you need in rural India right now is you need a massive scheme just to feed people. There are 4 man-made famines, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Sudan, and one more. 4 that the UN has called critical threshold level famines. The UN asked for some $400 million to cover food delivery in these famine areas. And they were able to raise some 10, 12 million. I'm just coming to that because when we think of cash transfer schemes, etc., I mean, we live in a desperately hungry planet where people are surviving on marginal amounts of nutrition a day. And the schemes to ameliorate that are so absolutely anemic. The US budget is a great example of the values of the country. Whatever people, however nice people are, $700 billion to the military, $29 billion to the State Department. So $700 billion to the military, $29 billion for diplomacy. Who cares about the State Department? It's not an equal player with the Pentagon. Please don't imagine, just because these are 2 cabinet secretaries, that they're equivalent. One is running a budget of $700 billion, the other $29 billion. Overseas aid is embarrassingly low. and even getting sliced further. So the situation of peril in the rest of the world is so great. I mean, my feeling is when I, talk about ISIS and the military, I'm amazed that more mutinies haven't broken out around the planet Earth. I'm amazed when we say in Mexico it's perilous, another journalist was killed yesterday, horrible, the drug killings. I'm amazed that there's not more of this. This city is a great example of fear. 1871, there was a massive fire, the Chicago fire. 1872, a relief society was created. It was barely taking care of the workers. So the workers then marched on the relief society. They were bludgeoned, some of them to death, up near, Water Street. Now, what is it? How do you say it? Wacker Drive? Wacker Drive. Then in 1877, during the general strike around the United States, there was a big demonstration, again up in that loop area, at City Hall, and there was the so-called Battle of the Viaduct. Hundreds of workers got their bones broken because this city's elite feared the Paris Commune. The history of the Paris Commune was very alive, 1871, summer of 1871. They beat the workers into submission here. Imagine around the world, I'm amazed that more people don't rise up. In that sense, why I don't believe in the imminent arrival of fascism is that why do you need fascism when ideology is doing your work for you? Why is it that people are all around the world believe they can become entrepreneurs? The ideology of entrepreneurialism has succeeded. It has saturated the global consciousness. So last year, I went to a rural area in India, and I was talking to farmers in a wretched area. People had cell phones. They said, the government told us we have downloaded this app. It's going to improve our understanding of prices. It might improve the understanding of prices, that's true. But they're starving. Input prices are up. Fertilizer price, all these prices are up, and price supports have disappeared in the market. So this is the situation we are in. So when we think of the rest of the planet, if I were rich, I would build a bigger moat. I would order more crocodiles to swim in it. I would order more pikemen to stand and defend my terrain, my little keep, from the revolt of the masses. Because if the rich in America think that these Trump voters are the masses coming and screaming at them, they haven't seen anything yet.